anytime you guys have got questions, thoughts or comments, please don't hesitate to interact. I'm grateful that you've come along at short notice. Just to reiterate and add to my good friend Dixon's story, what he didn't say to you was that he informed me a couple of days ago on WhatsApp whether I would be happy to have a chat with a few people. The next thing I know, a letter had gone out inviting everyone to a special talk. So hopefully I don't disappoint. But what we're going to talk about today, very briefly, is the importance and the impact of sports law in the sports world. Now that might sound like a rather self-evident thing to look at. However, I'm sure all of you to certain extents will be aware of the different complexities we have between national tribunals, international tribunals, regulations at confederational level, national level, international level, and all of the conflicts that we have in between. So what I would like to discuss with you today, briefly, is why we have the regulations in this way. What are some of the historical, cultural points that have taken us to the current situation in sports, and then to outline what the current situation in sports regulation actually is. I'm also very pleased to see that I think, if I'm not mistaken, we've only got 2 footballing people. We've got one gentleman from FAS, and we've got one gentleman from the, was it the Players Union?
Yeah.
Excellent. Football is 90% of what I do, and 100% of what I answer questions on. So hopefully we'll have questions, not only from you guys, but also from, I'm sure the boxing guys will want to speak about some things as well. I'm permitted to say some stuff, I'm not permitted to say other things, but of course, rowing, canoeing, netball, everything else that you guys want to discuss, where we've had some exposure to that sport, esports as well, Dixon and I have discussed it many, many times. Where we've had exposure, we'll try and assist you accordingly. So to begin, those that have been burdened by my sessions in the past will know that it's commonplace for me to start off with a quotation, and today is no different. The quotation I've chosen for today, I like using that joke. 13 years later, I'm still here, and I do love it. I do love it because there are a number of different facets that we have to deal with, but it's always important to understand, again, why we're here. So very quick, for the sake of housekeeping, today we're just going to provide an introduction and an overview on the sporting ecosystem today, why the regulations are how they are. We'll go through a quick historical whistle-stop tour, and we'll discuss some of the impacts of sports regulation. This is not, I hope, going to be too challenging. You're all sports administrators and sports lawyers to certain extents, so I don't expect this to be rocket science. As I said, if you do want to speed up, we'll speed up. If you want to slow down and expand on things. The irony, however, is that with these regulations, we probably see even more chaos than Sir Edward Grayson would have liked. So Sir Edward Grayson was someone who was renowned to be a sports-mad barrister. And I followed a similar pathway in a sense. I'm nowhere near as distinguished, but I was called to the bar in England and Wales. I practiced in criminal defence for several years, and then I realised after I transitioned into sports that I now know even more criminals. But here we are. I'm still here, 13 years later. I like using that joke. 13 years later, I'm still here. And I do love it. I do love it because there are a number of different facets that we have to deal with. But it's always important to understand, again, why we're here. So very quick, for the sake of housekeeping, today we're just going to provide an introduction and an overview on the sporting ecosystem today, why the regulations are how they are. We'll go through a quick historical whistle-stop tour, and we'll discuss some of the impacts of sports regulation. This is not, I hope, going to be too challenging. You're all sports administrators and sports lawyers to certain extents, so I don't expect this to be rocket science. As I said, if you do want to speed up, we'll speed up. If you want to slow down and expand on things, we'll slow down and expand on things. I'm here for as long as I need to be until my flight tomorrow. So any questions, we can cover that. And I hope that at the end of the session, it will reinforce to a certain extent the knowledge that you already have. I'll aim for this to be quite polemic in its view, and just to clarify some of the things that we will cover, we will try and cover why the regulations are as they are from a societal and historical perspective. But of course, we don't have enough time to cover all of the laws. If you have specific points with regards to Zambian law, there may be general principles I'll be happy to assist you with, but of course I'm not a Zambian qualified lawyer, so please forgive me that I might not be able to go into too much detail at that level. So, to begin, how did we get here? How did we get to where we are in sports law and sports regulation globally today? Now, what I'd like to do is go through several definitions of the word sport. Let's break it right down to the bare bones and understand what we're actually talking about. For those of you that are lawyers in the room or are studying to be lawyers, it's important to always understand from a definitive perspective what the nature of your situation is, what the subject of your situation is. However, it's quite easy to gloss over what sport actually is. If you go out onto the street and you ask 100 people, you might get 100 different definitions. Many of them would include something along the lines of competition, it's got to be physical, but sport is actually a lot wider than those elements alone. So we'll define sport, we'll look at how the word sport itself has developed over years, and then we'll talk briefly about key principles in sports law and sports regulation. Furthermore, we'll talk about the evolution of sport itself and how that juxtaposes with the evolution of society. That is where we get to the key point of sports governance, sports regulation today, because of course, now we have a situation where sport is governed and it's intrinsically linked with eyeballs and with money. Money from various different routes. It could be from the private sector, it could be from the public sector. But these are things that were not prevalent within sports governance 50 years ago. It barely existed. Sport was generally a voluntary thing all around the world. So we have to see how sport is developed and how that connects with the development in society overall. So just going right back to the linguistic origins of sport, the word sport. What does sport actually mean? Now, sport can be derived from the word sporten, which is a Middle English verb, and the literal meaning of this word is to divert. This also has connections to the old Latin term desporto, which also has a literal meaning of carrying away. So we can immediately see the essence of what sport was seen to be back in the day, and still is to a certain extent at grassroots levels now. Am I in your way, boss? Or?
No, it's fine.
Okay. If I am, just tell me to move. You don't have to be polite. You can just.
Oh, okay.
It's fine. So this all alludes to the leisurely nature of sport. But this has fundamentally changed over time, particularly at the higher levels and specifically in disciplines such as football or basketball you guys were discussing a little while ago. Now, the term sport has also been derived, as many say, from the old Latin slang term deportu. Now, this was a term that was used to describe, it was an adjective used to describe a number of games that the seafarers in the Mediterranean would design and then they would play when they reach back to port, when they get back home. As the Italian saying goes, si non è vero è ben trovato, which basically means it might not be true, but it's a fairly well-sounded story. So it's probably a bit like these modern-day comic books. There are multiple origins. We don't know exactly where the word comes from, but all of them seem to lead to one thing, which is a pastime, a leisurely activity, something you do to carry yourself away from your reality, whatever that reality might have been, fishing, agriculture, construction, or whatever else it may be. Now, something else that we can add to it, another layer that we can add to the concept and the ideology of sport, is something that Edward Grayson used to talk about as well. Now, he certainly didn't coin the idea, but he used to talk about the Corinthian principles. And the Corinthian principles also underpin the ideology of sport, which still remains at a grassroots level. Sport is a leisure activity. It's based on fair play, self-discipline, health and education. All of these pillars or tenets that we all look at, and maybe we try to instill into people in our community, our own children, when we send them off to school to play football, to play rugby, focusing on fair play, discipline, education, and all of these wonderful, almost fluffy ideas that we like to see in sport. And it's not to say that this doesn't exist anymore. It still does, but it started to develop. Gardner, in his book entitled Sports Law, also said exactly the same thing. The emphasis on sport is on being a distraction, something that gives pleasure. Now, because of this ideology of sport being something that was leisurely, something that was fun, sport has always been governed in a slightly different way to the rest of society. This has developed and has evolved to what it is now. In some countries we have legal protections. In some disciplines we have regulatory protections by all of the statutes and the regulations that we have for each different sport. So we have something in sport known as the principle of autonomy. Has anyone here come across this principle before? Has anyone heard about it? No? Fantastic. All right. That means I can go into it a little bit. So the principle of autonomy is something that essentially anchors how sport is governed today all around the world. Now, this is an ideology that was founded by the International Olympic Committee many, many years ago. And governance in sport is generally driven by this principle. It recognizes that sport occurs within society, within the framework of society. However, it focuses on sport having freedom to govern itself, freedom to elect its officers, an element of freedom to ensure that society basically doesn't get in the way of the rules and the culture and the context of the sporting discipline itself. So if we look at the extraction from the fundamental principles of Olympism, the extraction that I've put there, the quote, is to ensure that we can freely establish and control the rules of the sport, determining the structure, the governance of the organization, and enjoying the right of elections free from any outside influence.